Hello, everyone. My name is Asta. I'm the product marketing manager here at Payhawk, and today I am accompanied by Robbie Hadfield. Robbie here is the GM of Carton Expenses in Payhawk, and today we're going to chat about how to get finance out of the weeds. Robbie, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Asta. Really excited by this one. And the reason why is personal experience, really. I've been a previous financial controller, head of finance. So I'm looking at this sort of from two perspectives. One, having been there and sort of being dragged into the weeds too much by some of these processes, frankly, and a number of horror stories probably in there as well, whilst also now looking to solve this from a product perspective. So yeah, a topic close to my heart, but also a topic that creates an emotional reaction for me. There were many sort of days of frustration related to card and expenses, and it's something that I really enjoy solving now today. Hopefully.
It's good to hear you come from the lens of finance person and you are here to solve the problems that finance teams are facing. So, as you know, Robbie, currently finance team is not overloaded because the team is inefficient, but it's mostly because they are doing the manual work that the system can do. They should have delegate this to a system instead. So, why do finance teams spend so much time doing this manual work, like chasing receipts, fixing data, and pushing for approvals, in your opinion?
Yeah, ultimately, the holy grail of finance information is making it usable for decision-making purposes for the variety of stakeholders that you're dealing with. And this is where finance teams are often trading off those stakeholders. What do you need to do for statutory reporting? What do you need to do for your board reporting? What do you need to do for your departmental budgets? And even sometimes on the employee level with specific you sort of get L&D kind of budgets by employee or kind of specific employee benefits that go through. So ultimately, where this goes to next is it's important for all of those reasons, but if you don't do this right, you can't start month end. And month end is the process where you balance all of these stakeholders and you drive decision useful information. If you can't get to month end because of issues with receipts chasing or coding or whatever the issue is, you can't actually fulfill the key add value obligation. And this is where ultimately that's where the negative reputation comes to finance, which is they're always backwards looking and not forwards looking, because you're so focused on fixing things, you never get the time to actually add value in the organization. But you have to focus on these backward looking things, because if you don't do that, you can't fulfill your core mandate. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, that one.
So, it's again going back to focusing on what matters, right? And in this case, what do you think are the kind of work that should never require human effort in modern expense processes?
Yeah, I think there's probably two or three key activities. One is correction of coding. I think with sort of modern spend management, with AI, with sort of more automation logics, you can definitely automate most of the coding. And this is where that need to correct coding from employees should reduce drastically. And I don't think the fix of just giving everything to the employee is really a time saver. I think it just creates more work for correction. The next one I would say is chasing. I think you can automate chasing of people, especially if you can then do it in tools that employees are used to living in. And this is where Slack is a great example, Microsoft Teams, rather than having to get the employee to log into the expense management software, if you can do the chasing within sort of where employees live and Slack and Teams and the approvals there, you often get better compliance as well, because it's easier to adopt these processes. So those would be the sort of the key things for me, is better coding through automation and data rules logics, but also better chasing and do that in the platforms where employees actually live, and you'll achieve better compliance.
So it's again meeting the employees where they are, be it Slack, be it Teams, wherever they are. So we're talking about automation, right? What do you think is the difference between automating steps and orchestrating the whole full flow?
It's an interesting question, that one, because, okay, you can automate a step with a mobile app, let's say, and you take a picture of the receipt. But then you might have bottlenecks later down the line. And I think, and this is where I think finance teams can get a bit guilty of looking at step by step too much and not taking a holistic view of the overall process. And I often see this when it comes down to budget controls, actually, which is you spend so much time building a huge annual budget to try and make department heads accountable, etc., and then you don't align it with your approval processes, which then means that the accountability is in the wrong place, and then you lack sort of that real-time visibility. So I think what I would say here is you do need to have a holistic view of how you orchestrate a whole process, and ultimately the value judgments that you have with that. And often I'm just thinking, what are the key value judgments for a finance team within an expenses context? Is budget accountability for the business so that finance are not having to do their job for them, regulation of policies, proactive approval of spend, but then it's also life cycle hygiene, getting the submission of expenses, the approval of expenses taking place quickly, so that ultimately you can spread that finance workload throughout the month rather than creating month-end bottlenecks. So those are just examples I thought I would give, but it's ultimately the finance team needs to be thinking of their core principles before they design a process, so therefore they get the right people doing the right tasks and ultimately driving the right culture in the organization. I like to tie everything back to culture. I think expenses, card and expenses, is a great example of how everyone in the organization interacts with this at the kind of the same level. And that's not often the case, where everyone has that shared experience. But if you can get this right, I think you can have huge cultural benefits in your organization as well.
So we talk about automation and manual work, right? So in your opinion, what should employees do versus what the system should handle automatically?
Yeah. I'd love to have a poll at this point and ask all finance people in the world, how good do they think their employees are at coding expenses? And I bet you they would all say terrible, or varying degrees of badness, effectively, because I think trying to educate employees on importance, getting this right, etc., it's always a bit of a challenge. And I think, with the greatest of respect to finance teams, I think flogging a dead horse in that one, because employees, it's never going to be their key priority to drive coding or logics like this. And a lot of these logics are pattern or rules based. So actually, in a modern spend management system, especially with AI, there are so many different automation logics that you can use ultimately to reduce the number of fields the employee fills in. And this is where, me personally, the less you give to the employee, the less likely they get it wrong, frankly. And this is where you can even do this with sort of free text fields in this day and age, with I'm just thinking in Payhawk with our note field. For card and expenses, it's effectively a business reason field. It's something we do populate by AI. The employee can still adjust it, but by naturally filling it in already for them, you're giving them an indication of what finance are looking for. And then it's they're a reviewer rather than a full inputter. And I think it means you often get better data because there's natural education as they go through the process. So reduce the number of fields the employee gets, and I think you're happier. And this is where either it's AI-led GL coding, whether it's employee-based locations, departments, cost centers, etc., or supplier-based sometimes. But it's all of these logics, I think, you don't need the employee to do the full coding. And this is where, if I were to give practical advice, you really don't want your employees filling in more than 2 to 3 fields. Ideally, get it to 1 or 0, but anything more than 2 to 3, I think you're fighting a losing battle, would be my comment.
So, Robbie, you mentioned about reducing the manual work so finance can focusing on the strategic work, right?
Yeah.
And what do you think is the metric that show finance is moving from tactical work, operational work to a more strategic work, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think I'll be annoying and say there's no one metric that's a silver bullet here. I'll be a little bit annoying and say that. But I think ultimately, this is something that finance have seen over the last 20 to 30 years. We're trying to move finance teams from being a financial accounting, transactional accounting kind of world to the add value services of finance. And a lot of this is linked to FP&A, investment decisions, board reporting, business partnering, treasury optimization, all of these kind of add value activities. For me, if I was CFO, I think the first thing I would look at is the investment decision I make in headcount. How many FTEs are working on financial accounting versus add value services? Because I think if you have good systems and good processes, you can reallocate people from those financial accounting kind of bucket towards more of the add value. So I think that's a straight away is kind of a headcount measure. I'm not trying to reduce headcount in finance teams. I'm trying to move that headcount from a backwards looking view of the world towards more of a forward looking view of the world. And maybe that means you need different people with different skills. But I don't think it's a cut of headcount at all. Then so that's kind of CFO level. And I think you've then got some metrics that get you a little bit more into the weeds here. And what I would be looking at is ultimately accuracy of forecasting, I think is a crucial one here. And this is where, for a lot of FP&A kind of roles, one of their key KPIs is forecast accuracy. And whether that be on a P&L basis or on a cash flow basis, I think treasury, that cash flow forecasting view as well, because the more accurate you can make those sort of forecast accuracy elements, ultimately, the better the business can optimize its cash, optimize its decision making, because you're not getting as many sort of fires during the month or during the quarter. And it means that you can be working on the next quarter strategically. So I would look at sort of forecast accuracy from that perspective. I think ultimately the other one I would talk about is budget utilization. It's another accuracy metric, I would say, but there's a bit of an art form to budget utilization or sort of forecast utilization, which is if people are in line with their plan, we're doing a good job from an add value perspective. We're planning well as an organization. We're executing well on that plan. It's a sign of operational excellence. And ultimately, I think those things are really key for finance to really drive sort of process and operations excellence throughout the organization, so that there's then more focus on the forward-looking things which ultimately drive growth in the business 2 to 3 quarters ahead.
Okay, thank you, Robbie. So yeah, you mentioned about finance team using their time to do more forecasting in the future, right? But how do you set the finance team for success for this? What do you think can enable the finance team to get 30 hours a month back, for example?
The holy grail of getting people from financial accounting to that add value activity. I think let's look at the really manual, annoying tasks. I think correcting coding of employees is a great example. I think with automation logics, with AI, you can definitely do that. and this is where, if you look at this in a Payhawk context, we call this our financial controller agent, and it has a variety of different sort of key skills that it adds to sort of our product, and it's chasing employees for receipts to try and improve receipt submission, so that you're getting a far more real-time process, little and often. I think another one would be sort of the agent driving categorization of expenses, whether it be the GL code or dimensions you need in the accounting system, and whether that's deterministic, AI driven, etc. The other things the AI agent's doing is it's driving approvals and doing that within the tools that employees are used to, such as your Slack, Teams. I think in the future, maybe I should mention this, maybe not, but I'll mention it. Getting invoices from websites automatically for those key subscriptions, completely automating the task of the employee and ultimately driving these things. So I think the key way to get time back for the finance team is really improving the life cycle sort of KPI. So time to submit sort of expenses. If you can automate the task, fantastic. And that's that sort of invoice fetching side. If you can speed up approvals, if you can improve the coding, so there's less manual changes at the sort of when finance are reviewing expenses, you're getting the data into the accounting system quicker, you're driving that continuous close, and ultimately the benefits then come in your better finance information for different stakeholders, better decision making, better forecasting. All of these benefits come from solving the basics at source. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do, is help finance teams achieve solving the basics at source.
Okay, thank you, Robbie. So, very interesting conversation. Just to conclude here, we talk about moving the finance team from the manual and operational work to the strategic work, forecasting, etc. Right? So, what are the key takeaways? Three key takeaways to move finance from firefighting to decision support.
So, thanks, Asta. I think three things, and I'll keep it short for this as practical advice. Sort out the basics at source. So get your coding logics, change that culture around employees getting expenses submitted in real time, because that will yield a lot of benefits down the line. I think that's number one. Number two is really get into the systems that employees live in, so that ultimately the life cycle is streamlined. And then three, I would say you've really got to look at these solutions holistically, rather than looking at them as steps. How you orchestrate these processes and align it with budget accountability, policy accountability, etc. If you can orchestrate these processes in the right way, have the right stakeholders involved, that's when you get the speed and you also get the right cultural outcomes. So those would be my top three things. But what I see finance teams, even in 2026, there is too much time focused on sort of the manual, the mundane activities. And ultimately, we want to free up that time for the add value services and change finance from that perception of finance being the computer says no kind of function to be the business enabler. And I think that's the goal here. And that's ultimately Payhawk, our big ambition here.
Okay, thank you so much, Robbie, for your insights. Very interesting conversations, and goodbye.
All right. Thanks very much, everyone.
Bye.